I've always enjoyed my own company. Growing up as an only child in a small, quiet town, solitude was something I got accustomed to early on. My parents were often busy with work, leaving me alone for most of the day, but I didn't mind. I would spend hours reading, drawing, or simply sitting in my room, enjoying the stillness around me. As I got older, the feeling of comfort in my own presence only grew stronger. I found it easy to be alone, easier than most people, in fact. While friends from college craved parties and social events, I craved the quiet of my apartment. There was something soothing about the silence of an empty room, knowing that no one else was around. Or at least, that's what I thought. This story takes place about 5 years ago when I was living alone in a small one-bedroom apartment just outside the city. It wasn't the most luxurious place, but it was affordable, and more importantly, it was mine. The building was old, with creaky wooden floors and thin walls, but it had a certain charm to it that made me feel at home. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I came home exhausted. I worked as a freelance writer, which meant I often spent long hours staring at my computer screen, typing away into the early morning hours. That day, I had been working on a demanding project and was drained both mentally and physically. All I wanted to do was crawl into bed and sleep for as long as my body needed. I remember walking into my apartment that evening, tossing my bag onto the couch, and heading straight for the bathroom to take a hot shower. The steam and warmth soothed my tired muscles, and I felt a wave of relaxation wash over me. Little did I know, it would be the last time I would feel at ease in my apartment for a long time. After my shower, I slipped into a pair of comfortable pajamas and headed to the kitchen to fix myself a simple dinner. I'm not much of a cook, so I settled for a bowl of cereal and a glass of water. The quietness of the apartment was almost palpable, but again, I found it comforting. I ate my meal in silence, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building as it settled. By the time I finished eating, it was already past midnight. I decided to head to bed, hoping to get a good night's sleep and recharge for the workday ahead. I turned off all the lights in the apartment, leaving only the small lamp beside my bed on, casting a soft, warm glow in the room. I climbed into bed, pulled the covers up to my chin, and closed my eyes. But then, something strange happened. Just as I was about to drift off, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. It was as if the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees in an instant. I opened my eyes and glanced around, but everything seemed normal. The window was closed, and there were no drafts that could have caused the sudden cold. Shrugging it off, I turned onto my side and tried to go back to sleep. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the corner of the room. It was so faint that, at first, I thought I was imagining it. But as I strained my ears, I realized it was the sound of breathing. Slow, steady breathing, like someone was standing in the corner watching me. My heart began to race, and I felt my body tense up. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I was overtired, and my mind was conjuring up sounds that weren't really there. But as the seconds ticked by, the breathing grew louder, more distinct. I sat up in bed, my eyes fixed on the dark corner of the room. The lamp beside me didn't reach that far, casting the corner in deep shadow. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence of something, or someone, standing there, watching me. My rational mind fought to take control. I told myself to get up, turn on the main light, and prove to myself that nothing was there, but I couldn't move. It was as if I was paralyzed, my body frozen in fear. The breathing continued, steady and unchanging, as if the thing in the corner knew I was aware of it and was savoring my fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my temple. I forced myself to move, swinging my legs over the side of the bed and planting my feet on the cold wooden floor. Slowly, I stood up, never taking my eyes off the dark corner. With trembling hands, I reached for the switch on the wall and flicked it on. Light flooded the room, banishing the shadows in an instant. The corner was empty. There was no one there, nothing that could have made that sound. I let out a shaky breath, my entire body trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I had heard it. Someone or something had been there. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, sitting up in bed and watching the corner, too afraid to sleep. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, I finally allowed myself to relax. Whatever had been there was gone, and I told myself it wouldn't come back. But I was wrong. The next night, the same thing happened. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I felt that same sudden chill. My heart began to race as I strained to listen, and sure enough, the soft sound of breathing returned. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, just like before. This time, I didn't sit up, I didn't dare move. I lay perfectly still, my eyes squeezed shut, pretending to be asleep. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. It was right there, just a few feet away from me, steady and unchanging. I could almost feel the presence hovering over me, watching me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. And then, just as suddenly as before, the breathing stopped. I lay there, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to open my eyes and look around. The room was empty, the corner shrouded in darkness, just as it had been the night before. This went on for weeks. Every night, without fail, I would hear the breathing. Sometimes it was soft and slow, almost gentle. Other times it was harsher, more ragged, like something struggling to draw breath. I tried everything I could think of, leaving the lights on, sleeping with music playing, even moving my bed to a different part of the room. But nothing worked. The breathing followed me, no matter where I was in the room. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My work suffered, and I started avoiding my apartment altogether. I would stay out as late as possible, dreading the thought of going back to that room and facing whatever it was that lurked in the darkness. But I knew I couldn't run forever. I had to face it, had to know what it was. So one night I decided to confront it. I sat in bed, my back pressed against the headboard, a flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, ready to call for help if I needed to. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, listening for the telltale sound of breathing. And sure enough, it came. It's strange how silence can be more unsettling than any noise. I always used to think that the scariest part of being alone at night was the possibility of a sound breaking the quiet, a creak of the floorboards, the rattle of a window, or a disembodied whisper from somewhere deep in the dark. But I've learned that it's the silence itself, the oppressive stillness, that can make the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Because silence lets your imagination run wild. It makes you aware of every breath, every twitch, every beat of your heart. It fills your mind with questions, making you wonder if you're truly alone. This story happened when I moved into my first apartment right after college. I had saved up for years, working part-time jobs while studying to afford a place of my own. It was nothing fancy, a small studio apartment on the third floor of an old building that had seen better days. But it was mine, and that's all that mattered. I remember feeling proud as I carried the last box up the narrow staircase, the wood creaking beneath my feet with every step. The apartment was sparsely furnished, just a mattress on the floor, a tiny kitchen table with two mismatched chairs, and a single armchair by the window. But I didn't care. I was finally independent, finally living on my own. It felt like the start of a new chapter. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, arranging my few belongings, and getting used to the creaks and groans of the building settling around me. There was a large mirror hanging on the wall opposite my bed, left behind by the previous tenant. Things changed on the fourth night. I had been working late, trying to finish a freelance project, and by the time I crawled into bed, it was already past midnight. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I lay there for a while, staring up at the ceiling, feeling my body relax as sleep began to pull me under. That's when I noticed it, the mirror. It was positioned in such a way that from where I lay, I could see a reflection of the entire room. The soft glow from the street lamp outside filtered in through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. But something about the mirror seemed off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a strange feeling in my chest, a sensation like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just overtired and imagining things, but the longer I stared at the mirror, the stronger the feeling grew. I sat up, my eyes locked on the reflective surface. My own face stared back at me, pale and drawn in the dim light. Everything in the room looked the same as it did in reality. The armchair, the table, the bed, except for one thing. In the corner of the reflection, just at the edge of the mirror's frame, I thought I saw a shadow. It was barely noticeable, a dark smudge against the wall that seemed to flicker for just a second before disappearing. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, and looked again. The corner was empty. There was nothing there. Shaking my head, I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin. I was just tired. That was all. Just a trick of the light. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see that shadow again. Every time I looked, I told myself it was the last time, that I was being ridiculous. And yet, I couldn't stop. I felt trapped in a cycle of anxiety and anticipation, waiting for something to happen. Finally, at some point in the early morning hours, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next day, I pushed the incident to the back of my mind. I had work to do, bills to pay, and I didn't have time to worry about a shadow in a mirror. But that night, as I lay in bed once more, I couldn't help but glance at the mirror again. Nothing. I sighed in relief, closing my eyes and settling into the pillows. But just as I was about to drift off, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. My heart began to race, and I opened my eyes, turning my gaze back to the mirror. There it was. The shadow was back, darker and more defined this time. It wasn't just a smudge. It had a shape, a vaguely humanoid figure standing in the corner of the room, its outline blurry and indistinct. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching. I sat up slowly, my throat tightening with fear. The room itself was empty. I could see that much. There was no one in the corner. But in the mirror's reflection, the shadow remained, as if it existed only within that glassy surface. I told myself to get up, to turn on the lights, to do something. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my body locked in place by a primal, bone-deep terror. All I could do was stare at the shadow in the mirror, my mind racing with questions and doubts. What was it? Was I hallucinating? Had I gone mad? And then slowly the shadow moved. It shifted, just slightly, swaying to the side as if adjusting its stance. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was real. Whatever it was real. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at that thing in the mirror. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the seconds bleeding into minutes, the minutes into hours. At some point, the sky outside began to lighten, the first rays of dawn creeping through the window. As the sunlight hit the mirror, the shadow faded, dissolving into nothingness. I didn't sleep at all that day. Instead, I tore the apartment apart, searching for anything that could explain what I'd seen. I inspected the mirror, running my hands over its surface, looking for hidden compartments or tricks of the light. But there was nothing. It was just a mirror, a heavy old mirror with no secrets. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it would be back. That night, I decided to test something. I set up my phone on the kitchen table, propping it up so that its camera faced the mirror. If the shadow appeared again, I would catch it on video. I needed proof, not just for myself, but to show someone, anyone, that I wasn't losing my mind. I climbed into bed, my body tense with anticipation. Hours passed, the silence stretching out endlessly. And then, just past 2 a.m., it happened. The shadow appeared. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, as it slowly formed in the mirror's reflection. It was clearer this time, more defined. I could see the vague outline of a head, shoulders, and arms. It stood there, unmoving, its faceless gaze fixed on me. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep breathing, to keep watching. I couldn't let it know I was afraid. Not again. And then, with a shuddering breath, I glanced at my phone. My stomach dropped. The screen was blank. The camera wasn't recording. My hand shook as I reached for the phone, fumbling with the settings. I knew I had set it up correctly. I knew it should have been recording, but somehow the footage was gone, erased, as if it had never been there. Panic welled up inside me, and I looked back at the mirror. The shadow hadn't moved. It just stood there, silent and still, and then, slowly, its head began to turn. It was looking at the phone. It knew. I scrambled out of bed, stumbling backward until I hit the wall. The shadow didn't follow. It just stood there, its gaze fixed on the phone as if mocking me. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the next. The shadow never left. No matter what I did, it was always there, waiting for me in the mirror, watching, smiling. And the worst part, I can't leave. I tried, but every time I look into a mirror, any mirror, it's there, waiting. I've never been afraid of being alone. In fact, I often preferred it. There's a certain peace that comes with having your own space, your own time to think and just be. But solitude can be a double-edged sword. It gives your mind room to wander, to notice things it might have missed if it were distracted by the presence of others. And sometimes, the things you notice when you're alone are things you wish you hadn't. It started when I moved into a new place a few years back. It was a small one-bedroom rental in an older part of town, tucked away at the end of a quiet street. The building was old, with a history that seemed to seep from its very walls. Every floorboard creaked, and every pipe groaned in the silence of the night. But I liked it. There was a certain charm to its antiquated quirks. Plus, the rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed nice enough. The only thing I found odd was the closet in the bedroom. It was larger than most, almost like a small walk-in, with a heavy wooden door that looked out of place in the otherwise plain room. The wood was dark and warped, the paint around the edges peeling slightly, as if it hadn't been used in years. I remember standing in front of it on my first night, a strange sense of unease prickling the back of my neck. There was something off about that closet, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to first night jitters and the general creepiness of moving into a new, unfamiliar place. I unpacked my clothes, hanging them neatly inside, and went about settling in. The first week passed without incident. I spent my days working from home, tapping away at my laptop in the living room, and my nights reading or watching TV until I grew tired enough to collapse into bed. The closet remained closed, its door blending into the shadows of the room. I barely thought about it, but then one night, something changed. I had stayed up late working on a project and was feeling particularly drained. I shuffled into the bedroom, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, and collapsed onto the bed. As I lay there, the silence of the apartment seemed to wrap around me like a blanket, thick and oppressive. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come. That's when I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there frozen, listening intently. The sound was faint, almost indistinguishable from the creaks and groans of the old building. But there was a rhythm to it, a cadence that sent chills down my spine. It was coming from the closet. I turned my head slowly, my gaze locking onto the dark wooden door. It was closed, just as I had left it, but the whispering continued, a low murmur that seemed to ebb and flow, like someone having a conversation just out of earshot. I sat up in bed, every muscle tense. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe it was just the wind, or a draft blowing through the old building. Maybe there was a gap in the wall that let in outside noises. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that this wasn't a natural sound. It was deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The whispering stopped abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of that door knew I was listening. I took a cautious step forward, my pulse hammering in my ears, and reached out with a trembling hand. The knob was cold under my fingers, and for a moment, I hesitated. Then with a deep breath, I turned it and yanked the door open. The closet was empty. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark, half expecting something to lunge out at me. But there was nothing. Just my clothes hanging neatly on their hangers, swaying slightly as if disturbed by a breeze that didn't exist. Swallowing hard, I closed the door and backed away, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Was I so tired that I was hearing things that weren't there? I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few days, I did my best to ignore the closet. I kept it closed at all times, avoiding looking at it whenever I was in the bedroom. But the whispers didn't stop. They were faint. So faint that I often thought I was imagining them. But every night, without fail, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I would hear that low, murmuring sound, like someone whispering secrets through the walls. I started staying up later and later, trying to tire myself out so I would fall asleep instantly and not have to lie there in the dark, listening. But it didn't help. If anything, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, one night, they changed. I was lying in bed, my eyes closed, trying to ignore the soft murmuring coming from the closet. But this time, instead of the usual unintelligible whispers, I heard something clear. My name. It was a soft, almost tender voice, whispering my name over and over again. Anna. Anna. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I shot up in bed, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. Silence fell over the room, thick and heavy. I sat there, staring at the closed closet door, waiting. But nothing happened. I stayed awake all night, my eyes fixed on that door, afraid to look away. The next day, I decided I'd had enough. I called my landlord, explaining that there was something wrong with the closet, that I kept hearing noises at night. He seemed skeptical, but agreed to come over and take a look. When he arrived, I led him to the bedroom and pointed at the closet door. "It's in there," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "It sounds like whispering." The landlord frowned, but to his credit, he didn't dismiss me outright. He opened the closet, stepping inside and inspecting the walls and floorboards. After a few minutes, he stepped back out, shaking his head. "There's nothing here," he said, his tone firm. "No drafts, no gaps in the walls. Maybe it's just the pipes. Old buildings like this tend to make strange noises." I wanted to argue, to insist that it wasn't just the pipes, that I had heard my name. But what could I say? I knew how it sounded, like I was losing my mind. So I just nodded and thanked him, watching as he left. The moment he was gone, I turned back to the closet, my skin crawling with unease. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the dark outline of the closet door. My name echoed in my mind, that soft, insidious whisper that seemed to burrow under my skin. And then, just as I was about to drift off, the door creaked open. It was slow, almost hesitant, the wood groaning softly as the door swung inward. I sat up, my heart in my throat, and watched as the darkness inside seemed to pulse and shift. Something moved in the shadows. A shape, vague, indistinct, slid out of the closet, its outline shimmering in the darkness. It was small, hunched, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, and as it stepped into the room, I heard it again. "Anna." The voice was soft, almost pitying, as if it knew exactly how terrified I was. I don't remember much after that. I think I screamed. I think I ran. But by the time the sun rose, I was outside, sitting in my car with the engine running, staring up at the dark windows of my apartment. I never went back inside. To this day, I don't know what was in that closet, what it wanted, or why it called my name, and I hope I never find out. The house had been empty for years before I moved in. It stood alone at the end of a winding country road, its old wooden frame hidden behind a tangle of overgrown trees and ivy. The realtor had tried to gloss over its long-standing vacancy, making vague excuses about the previous owner's relocation and a difficult housing market. But I didn't care. It was cheap, quiet, and secluded, the perfect place for a fresh start. I remember the first time I pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. The house loomed above me, its windows dark and empty. There was something about the place that felt forgotten, like a memory left to gather dust. But I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was being overly dramatic. After all, I'd come here to escape the bustle of the city, to find peace and solitude. This was supposed to be a new beginning. The house itself was a charming, if somewhat dilapidated, two-story structure with an attic that stretched the length of the roof. It was the attic that had caught my eye in the first place. The realtor had mentioned it offhandedly, calling it a bonus space that could be turned into a studio or storage. I'd always wanted a place where I could write in peace, a quiet retreat away from distractions. The idea of setting up a small desk by the attic window, where I could look out over the sprawling countryside as I worked, seemed idyllic. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days cleaning, repairing, and slowly turning the house into a home. There were the usual noises of an old structure settling, creaks and groans as the wind pushed against its walls, the occasional rattle of pipes. But I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was the attic. It started subtly. I would be lying in bed at night, the house quiet around me, when I'd hear it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from above. At first I dismissed it as the sound of branches brushing against the roof, or perhaps an animal nesting in the rafters. But the tapping persisted, night after night, always around the same time, just past midnight. One evening, after a particularly long day of unpacking, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed the narrow staircase that led up to the attic. The air grew colder as I ascended, a musty smell filling my nostrils. When I reached the top, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door's handle. The tapping stopped. Swallowing my unease, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The attic was just as I'd remembered it from my first walkthrough, empty and dark, its slanted ceiling draped in shadows. The only light came from the small round window at the far end, through which the moon cast a pale, ghostly glow. I swept the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just old beams and cobwebs. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and turned to leave, feeling a bit foolish. But just as I reached the door, something caught my eye. There, in the dust on the floor, were footprints. Small, delicate prints, as if someone had been walking barefoot across the attic. They led from the far corner to the center of the room, then abruptly stopped. My heart skipped a beat. I knelt down, examining them more closely. The prints were faint, barely more than impressions in the dust. But they were unmistakably human. A chill ran down my spine, and I stood up quickly, backing away. I wanted to tell myself that I was overreacting, that the prints had been there all along and I'd simply overlooked them. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I would have noticed. I'd been in and out of the attic enough times to know it had been undisturbed. With a sense of growing unease, I closed the door and went back downstairs, my mind racing. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that there had to be a logical explanation. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints from my mind. The tapping resumed, louder than before. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to focus on my work, pushing the incident out of my mind. But the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, that familiar dread crept back in. I found myself glancing up at the ceiling more and more often, listening for the sound I knew would come. And sure enough, just past midnight, the tapping began again. I clenched my teeth, resisting the urge to run up to the attic and confront whatever was making the noise. Instead, I grabbed my phone and hit record, holding it up toward the ceiling. For nearly an hour, I sat there, my eyes glued to the screen, the rhythmic tapping filling the silence. When the noise finally stopped, I played back the recording. The tapping was clear, each sound distinct and deliberate. But as I listened closer, something else caught my attention. Something beneath the tapping, almost too faint to hear. A voice. It was soft, little more than a whisper, but unmistakable. I strained to make out the words, my pulse racing. "Help me. Please." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, unable to move. The voice had been clear, real. Something was in my house. I don't remember how long I sat there, frozen with fear. Eventually, I forced myself to move, grabbing my phone and heading upstairs. I had to know. I couldn't keep living in this state of fear and uncertainty. The attic door creaked open, the air inside even colder than before. I stepped inside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Silence. And then from somewhere deep in the shadows I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, like something moving slowly across the floor. I swung the flashlight around, the beam darting from corner to corner. But the attic was empty, except for the footprints. They were back, clearer this time. And they were moving. I watched, horror rising in my throat, as the prints formed one after another in the dust, as if some invisible figure was walking slowly toward me. Closer and closer. "Who are you?" I gasped, stumbling backward. The shuffling stopped. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, softly, I heard the voice again. "Help me." The words were a rasping whisper, filled with pain and desperation. And then, almost imperceptibly, the footprints began to fade, dissolving into the dust as if they had never been there. I fled. I don't remember running down the stairs, don't remember grabbing my keys and driving away. I just remember the fear, the sense that something terrible was waiting in that attic, something that wasn't meant to be seen. I never went back to that house. I couldn't. I left everything behind, my belongings, my furniture. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. The house still stands, empty and alone at the end of that winding road. I think about it sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and the darkness seems to press in. I think about those footprints, about the voice in the attic, and I wonder if even now it's still up there, waiting, whispering, asking for help. When I first moved into my new apartment, I was thrilled. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom on the outskirts of town, but it was mine. The building was old, the kind that creaks and groans with every gust of wind, but I loved the character it had. With its arched doorways and tall windows, it felt like a place that had a story to tell. The bedroom, though, was my favorite part. It was large, with a high ceiling and a single tall window that let in the morning light. The bed, an old four-poster I'd inherited from my grandmother, fit perfectly against the far wall, its headboard set against the plaster like it had always been there. The space beneath the bed was deep, more like a small cavern than a regular storage area. It could easily have fit several suitcases or boxes if I'd had them. But I didn't. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, settling in, and getting accustomed to the new place. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that's both soothing and unnerving. I was used to the constant hum of city life, the background noise that never seemed to stop. Here, though, the silence was almost oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides when the sun went down. And that's when it started. It was subtle at first. I would be lying in bed, my eyes closed, drifting off to sleep when I would hear it. A soft rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. My eyes would snap open, heart pounding, but the room would be still, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the sound of the wind slipping through a crack in the window frame or the old wood settling. But night after night, the noise persisted. The sound seemed to come from beneath the bed. One night, after hours of tossing and turning, I finally decided to investigate. I leaned over the edge of the mattress, holding my breath, and peered into the darkness. The space beneath the bed was pitch black, deeper and darker than I remembered. I reached for my phone, switching on the flashlight, and shone it into the void. Nothing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and leaned back, shaking my head at my own paranoia. But as I turned off the light and lay back down, I could have sworn I heard something shift beneath me. A faint, almost imperceptible movement. The next morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was an old apartment after all. Old apartments made noises. But that night, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the light. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling as the hours ticked by. Just past midnight, the rustling began again. This time, I didn't move. I didn't lean over the edge or grab my phone. I just lay there, listening, every nerve on edge. And then I heard it. a faint, low whisper coming from directly beneath me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was so soft, so low that I almost couldn't make out the words. But there was no mistaking it. It was a whisper, a murmur that sent chills down my spine. "Come closer." The voice was breathy, almost playful. I clenched my eyes shut, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. There was no way I'd heard that right. No way. But then it came again. "Come closer. Look." The words were clear, taunting, as if the thing, whatever it was, knew I was listening. My entire body went rigid, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out of the apartment, to leave. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own fear. Slowly, ever so slowly, I turned my head, staring at the empty space beside the bed. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I knew something was there. The whispering stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, staring into the shadows, waiting. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the apartment was filled with the soft light of dawn, and everything seemed normal. But I knew better. I tried to tell myself that it was a dream, a product of my overactive imagination. But that night, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the apartment grew dark, the fear returned. I lay in bed, every muscle tense, listening. The rustling started again, soft and rhythmic. And then the whisper. "Come closer. Look." My stomach twisted with dread. I knew I should leave, pack my things, and find somewhere else to stay. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Some twisted part of me needed to know what was beneath the bed. So I did the only thing I could think of. I got out my phone and started recording. The video was shaky, my hand trembling as I held it out over the edge of the bed. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but the rustling continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then, just as I was about to give up, the whisper came again. "Come closer." I dropped the phone. The screen landed face up, the camera pointing directly into the black space beneath the bed. And that's when I saw it. A face. Pale and twisted, its features contorted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. It was there, inches from the camera, staring back at me. Its eyes, black and empty, seemed to bore into my soul, that smile growing wider, impossibly wide. And then, slowly, it reached out a hand. I screamed, scrambling off the bed and stumbling back. The phone clattered to the floor, the screen going dark. I grabbed it, fumbling with the buttons, and turned on the flashlight, shining it wildly around the room. The space beneath the bed was empty. There was nothing there. No face, no hand, just dust and shadows. I ran. I don't remember leaving the apartment, don't remember getting into my car or driving away. I just remember the cold, clawing fear that gripped me. The image of that face burned into my mind. I ended up at a friend's place, babbling incoherently about what I'd seen. He tried to calm me down, tried to tell me it was just a nightmare. But I knew better. I went back the next day, in the bright light of morning, to grab my things. I couldn't bring myself to stay, not after what I'd seen. As I packed, I tried not to look at the bed, tried not to think about the voice or the face in the shadows. But then I noticed my phone, still lying on the floor where I'd dropped it. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly I picked it up and opened the camera app, my hands shaking. The video was still there. With a sense of growing dread, I hit play. At first, there was nothing, just the blackness beneath the bed, the sound of rustling. But then slowly, the image shifted. A face appeared, pale and smiling, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. And then it spoke. "Found you." The video ended. I left the apartment that day and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about that face. I think about the whispering, the way it called to me. And I wonder if, someday, it'll find me again.